I'd like to introduce to you Charles Carpenter. He's with the College of College of Biblical Studies in what city in Texas? Houston. I always want to say Dallas. And he's not just a professor with that organization. He teaches for a multitude of organizations. I didn't know that so many professors do that. So just learning about how he uses his talents is interesting, and it's given him a real breadth of information and learning and experience to share with us. He has done everything from help pilot the new SAT, to write curriculum for universities, to edit books for famous authors, to helping accreditation organizations determine what in the world makes a university a university. So with that, he's going to give us an honest assessment of the goals of modern universities, and we want to be informed as we develop expectations for advanced education for our classically educated students. It's not specifically about the Quadrivium. What we're trying to really do with this seminar is state the case of where we are and what the worldviews are and kind of what expectations are. It's like an introduction to a much longer conversation when we get to the various specific topics in later times. So I just wanted to let you know, from an expert's point of view, what the universities actually are looking for in our students and their concerns, which may turn out to be very different than our concerns. We'll hear. Okay, well, so welcome, Mr. Carpenter.
Well, thank you very much. One thing even I put on my notes here is that to make sure that I introduce myself and my kids, because oftentimes I jump directly into the talk and I forget all the essential things of life, right? So I am a homeschool dad. That's probably my favorite attribute. I'm home with my kids as much as I can, and I like being with them. The other thing is that I have a wonderful wife of 14 years, and we live in Houston, Texas. We're actually moving to Fort Worth, Texas here in about a few weeks. So there's a lot of things going in our... Go Frog, yeah. Well, let's say go Southwestern. Okay. So I have stayed in education pretty much my entire life. I never intended to be in education. It was never my goal. As a matter of fact, often when you set out to do something, that's the very thing that you never end up doing. And when I actually began college, I went to college because I was given a scholarship. I went to Liberty University, and I remember when I actually got to the admissions, and we waited in line, and they asked us, what our major wanted to be and such. And I come from a very rural community in California. So rural, if I were to give the name of it, only Spanish-speaking people would actually know what it means. It's a city called Manteca. So we are known as lard or fat. So as it relates to that, as you could probably imagine, this is the type of community I grew up in. So when I actually went to Liberty and they asked me the first question, meaning the question of what's your major, what do you want to do here? I actually asked them a question back. I said, well, what do you do here? I didn't really know. So I thought at that moment they were going to revoke me for acceptance, but they didn't. And they said, well, what do you want to learn to do? I said, well, my whole life, all I wanted to learn to do is to love God better. That's it. And so as a result, of course, they put me on a first degree plan, and I realized that was not the direction I wanted to go. I wanted to still love God better, but I didn't want to be a preacher. So as it relates to that, I just began to learn, and the whole goal of my learning was to just know God. And as it went, I actually finished Liberty pretty quickly, and got to do a few really cool things, but in graduating from Liberty, I wanted to never tell anybody that I was an athlete. That was one thing I was never going to do. I wanted to constantly separate this idea of education from every other thing. I didn't want anyone to know that because I did not want to go back to my rural mindset of, if they know that I'm a jock, if you will, then they're going to think that I'm an idiot, and as a result, they're not going to give me a job. Well, actually, that's not what happened. I got my first job, actually, because I told them that I wrestled. I was going to tell them no, I didn't, but I did tell them. And so as I told them, they said, we have a position for you, but a month before, they said, we have no position for you. So my point on that is oftentimes there is an illusory situation that we actually build up in our own minds that what people are asking for and what people want. And so what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm going to talk about the college consideration in light of that. I'm going to talk about it being a delusion, and I'm talking about as we parents. We think of it in a way maybe that we shouldn't. And then we're going to move to the college dilemma, and then hopefully we're going to discover a few things. I'm describing delusion as something that causes preoccupation, that is really only illusory. And here's what I mean by that. If some of you may have read Plato's Republic, and when you read Plato's Republic, you found that the most intriguing part of Plato's Republic was Plato's cave. And so in the Platonic cave, they looked at one thing, and they were so preoccupied by it, they became essentially delusional. And then when one guy actually came out of the cave, he wanted to convince everyone else, this is only fragments, or this is only images that you never really need to take notice of. You need to look up at the sun. And when you look up at the sun, you'll realize that everything that you have ever imagined is really not what you thought. And so what I am describing as delusion is oftentimes when we use the term accrediting, that type of thing, I'm going to describe those as those things that make us delusional. And then I'm going to move to the idea of dilemma. I think that we need to recognize the college dilemma. And the college dilemma is often they want to see our kids succeed more than we do. And here's what I mean by that. We think that they're this adversarial relationship, but they're really not. They want your kids to actually finish. Their whole accreditation, if you want to even use that term loosely, rides on the fact that they finish. And so that is one other thing. And I hope that what we discover is that we are looking at the wrong things. And so my thesis, I guess, of the talk is parents who remain preoccupied with wrong or false images encourage the present dilemma and will never discover, except through great arduous struggling, God's intended purpose for our kids. And so when we move on to the first delusion of college is that college actually makes us successful. If I were to ask this question to the crowd, and you know, I've always been afraid of doing this. Everybody says never to do this as a public speaker. Never ask the crowd anything because you don't know the answer you're going to get. So I'm doing this with fear and trepidation. How many of you went to college? Just real quick, raise a hand. How many went to college? Keep your hands up. How many are you doing the very thing that you actually are trained for? My point on that is you see that, well, see my fear? There was a few. The reason I'm saying that is often we see that more than half, or I would say at least 2/3 of the crowd put their hands down. And we have this idea that the very thing that we're training for is the very thing that our kid's going to do. And that often is the first delusion. We also forget that, or we often actually begin to go back to our kindergarten years of our homeschooling experience, right? Our kindergarten years of our homeschool experience, or our first years of homeschooling, we have this idea: I'm never going to give my kid what they need, right? We have this idea: I'm never going to do what is, and fill in the blank. What happens oftentimes is that the moment that we turn around and we go to this, we're at this brinks of college, we actually return back to that mode for some reason. They're never going to get what they need, and as a result, they're going to be losers in life. This is kind of our mindset, right? And so what we have to remember is, if we're even having a consumer concept, if we just have a consumer concept, we have to realize that no consumer asks what the philosophy is of their occupation. No consumer asks that. Unless, of course, if you're a college professor. The first time I was ever asked that was after my second graduate degree. After my second major professor job. I was never even asked my philosophy of education until just recently. My point on that is, that's usually not the thing that's asked, but that's the very thing that we should seek. What is the philosophy that we're actually trying to instill in our kids? Or what is the philosophy that child is being instilled on when they're at this certain college? And so we realize that no consumer asks that, but we should ask that. The second thing that we should realize is no consumer asks what college do they attend, usually, unless they're wanting to talk about some college polls or something in athletics. Normally, what goes by is you're actually doing your job well, and then typically they ask, did you actually attend a college? And sometimes when you answer the question, no, I didn't, they're actually shocked. You know, they say, no, I was homeschooled, right? And so usually they're shocked because they say, wow, they actually know what they're doing. And so also, no students going through the process should ever think, and we actually instill this in our kids oftentimes, no kid should have this concept in their own mind to say, you know what, if I go through this process, then I'll be gainfully employed. Because I remember my first job, my very first job. When I got out of college, I thought that, you know, I went to Liberty, I was successful, I got all the things that I wanted to get, and so on and so forth. And I remember when I got my first job, I told them that, you know, I'm an English person, I'm a Greek person, I know language well, you know, and so I thought that, hey, you know what, they're going to hire me. That's what I thought. And so they told me that you couldn't get a job until I actually told them, well, I wrestled. Oh, we've got a job for you, you see. But the job that they gave me, it was probably the best job I'd ever received, and it was teaching special ed. And the reason I say it was the best job that has ever been given to me is because it was so difficult. And it made me adapt in such a way that I never imagined. It's not something that you learn at college that makes you adapt to something like that. But it's the fire that college puts you under that makes you adapt to these things. So we have to realize that it's the fires of life that makes you adapt. It's the fires of life that makes you actually do the very things that you've probably been called to. We have to realize that work is not provided by the college. We have to realize that work is provided through a well-trained mind, one that sees needs and fulfills them according to God's purpose and God's design. We know that God is the one that through His gifting on your life makes room for you, right? Proverbs chapter 18:16 says that God makes room. It's almost that He pushes back all the things that are obstacles in your life because of your gifting and puts you in those places. The very things that I'm doing now could never be imagined. When I go back to college reunions, for example, they ask me what I do, and it's almost embarrassing to say. And the reason I say it's almost embarrassing to say is because they have this concept of what they intended for me to do. The community. They thought that I was actually going to be several things, either a Dr. Pepper driver or, because that's the actual big job in our community, right? So a Dr. Pepper driver, or they thought that I was going to work at the funeral home as a funeral person because my aunt was the major mortician and so on and so forth. You know, these are the types of things that they intended for me to do. But God moves those things away to put your child in the place or put you in the place where He designs you. And so we have this delusion that colleges do this, that this idea of being successful means that I go to this college or I do this certain thing. We want to dispel that. We want to dispel that in many ways. We don't want even a hint of that to be in our kids' minds. I go through kids all the time and I ask this big question. Why are you here at school? And the answer is always the same. To get a better job, to have a better life, to get more money. I always want to say, all of those answers that they just said is not because of college, it's because of something very different from college. And we want not to accentuate the wrong things to our kids. The second thing that I would say, the second delusion, is that colleges meet demands or meet the very things that you want them to meet in educational things. We have this idea if my school should actually educate my kid. They should educate my kid. But what we realize is that education only happens in communities, and the very community that happens is in the place where they're working, right? So we have this idea that learning takes, or we have this idea that education takes place, but what in reality is learning takes place, because that learning takes place because information is a prize there in college. I remember a lot of things I didn't know, and as a result I did know them in college, but that's not education, that's learning. There's a difference there. There's a great book on the subject that I strongly recommend. It's called Unbinding Prometheus by Donald Cowan. Now, it's a very difficult book to get. Let me just start by saying that, so that when you actually Google it and you realize, oh my gosh, it's $200. It's just because it's out of print. But my point on that is there's a very good book on this issue. The second thing, I don't want to go further than that. So it's this idea that learning and education, we have to understand that they're two different things. The second thing is that in learning, that senses create imaginations. That's what we're doing in classical conversations, in classical learning, is that we're trying to create images that actually touch real life. But real life is really not touched until wisdom is actually attained by this child. And so the third part of knowledge or wisdom is that knowledge is made available. They realize that they can go access it. So these are the three things that actually I would argue that this is what college teaches. These three things. And we're calling it education, but in reality, this is still the process of just learning. Education happens within the community where the application and dogma meet. And application and dogma meet at the place where the job is created, where there's space that God had cleared out for your child or for you to actually fill. And I know for me, I never would have imagined in my whole life as working with people with grave disabilities. I remember as soon as I finished working with this one school, for example, and working with disabled children, the very next thing that I did was, I remember I was in my apartment complex and I looked down, and there was a man being hoisted out of his car. Hoisted out of his car, and he was taken into his house. And I remember, and the reason I say hoisted out of his car, to be taken, he's quadriplegic. He lives in an iron lung. And so when Paul was taken out, I remembered, I said, you know what? I could do that. I could help this man. This was not something that I learned in college, but it's something that my dogma within the college, what I learned, actually met or applied to my life, and it made sense. And so then I took, of course, Paul, and I took Paul essentially, if you will, under my wing. I say that, but in reality, it was him that took me. He's a lawyer. He's a lawyer in Dallas. He's pretty famous as a Dallas lawyer. He does he does the full litigation. He's the longest living man that's ever lived in the iron lung. Very good friend of mine. And the reason I make mention of that is he has taught me more in the 2 or 3 years that I worked with him than probably anything that I ever learned in college. And that is where real education takes place. Wisdom is discovered within community. That word is where application and dogma take root. What we realize, what oftentimes is that what we do is we send our child, or we actually go off to college, and we throw out everything within the curriculum that actually causes those things to actually take place. We say credits are the most important, or something is the most important, but actually working within the community is not the most important. I would argue that it is. Learning is an internal dimension, but education is external. Learning is internal, but education is external. We have to realize that is our heritage. That is what we are to do. It's this idea of loving God, and of course, as a result, serving our neighbor. The delusion, number 3, I would say, is that college makes you educated. Remember, college might give some necessary tools for wisdom. It might do that. But remember, wisdom cannot be gained in ignorance. What I mean by that is, if there is somebody in the classroom who actually just doesn't get it and doesn't know. I know that for me, the biggest things that I learned in college was the very fact that the mentorship relationship I had with my professors were the best. And oftentimes we have this concept that if they go to University of Virginia, or if they go to these giant schools, that they're going to get something that is huge. I know for me, the personal mentorship relationship was the very thing that actually encouraged my true education. Also, we know that wisdom is not gained in isolation. That if a child doesn't do certain things within their educational environment, oftentimes it doesn't take root, and they never remember. We know that the very things that we try to memorize all of our lives, the very things we forget, it's because it has no context. I know it was a beautiful moment not too long ago when my daughter, we were hanging out, and we've been 3 years, I can't remember which, in classical conversations. And my daughter just finished her memory master. She was a memory master yesterday, praise the Lord. So they got to take my daughter out to dinner while I was on the plane. So I got to be there, in spirit, I guess. So when we were sitting and we were having this conversation out, it was my mother-in-law and I and my wife, and I teach history as well as English, and so I would think that I'd have all these historical reference points, right at the tip of my tongue, and of course everyone looks at me to do this. Well, I didn't have that. I remember there was something going on, and I forgot that it was during World War II. And my daughter, it was a wonderful moment when my 11-year-old piped in, and she goes, "Oh, Dad, that was in 1940 around during World War II." It was a wonderful experience because she got to join in the community. We can't learn in isolation, and oftentimes when we're focused on credits, we move toward this isolationism that doesn't actually apply to anything. And so we actually feed into that delusion. We also know that wisdom cannot be gained in inertia. It has to be moving. It has to be moving. I forgot to make mention that the Bible actually speaks to this idea that wisdom cannot be gained in ignorance. Remember Psalm 14:1, where God actually gives credence to atheists by a half of a verse, right? The fool says in his heart, there is no God. And so even in Proverbs 1, we have to realize that we want to put our kids or even ourselves under the people who have the fear of the Lord, because that is the only place at the beginning of wisdom, Proverbs 1. And we also need to know we need to not put them in a place where they're provoked to anger. I know that when I went to college, I went to both secular schools and I guess Christian schools, and as it relates to that, I know that I've been challenged hugely. There's only a couple of professors I can remember that I could actually say that did not apply to that verse, but that provoking me to anger. And I remember actually it was at a Christian school where I was provoked to anger. Interestingly, I told the professor, it was an interesting moment. I deal with language all the time, and so he had a point on the test that I answered, and I remember it was a debatable point. And he says, I'm not giving you points for that. You're going to get a B on this exam. And I said, my heavens, why? And he says, because your answer is not right according to my rubric. And I was like, your rubric is wrong. I still got the B. So what we have to realize is that wisdom also, like I said, wisdom is not gained in isolation, but in community. So why is this delusion so apparent? Why is this delusion so apparent for us? I would argue that it's because that we feed into the dilemma. We have three dilemmas. And the dilemma number one is that we have isolated professors. We have isolated professors. By the way, thank you back there, the AVP, because I totally forgot that I was supposed to be changing slides. I just realized that obviously I forget about introducing my family, but now I've realized I forgot the slide presenter. So this idea of isolated professors. Often what happens is this happens actually in the school where I teach. One professor says, look, you're the English teacher. As a result, you should be the one actually grading papers. I remember it got so bad one time that the math instructor was actually assigning a paper. The math instructor wanted to assign a paper on the properties of E in mathematics. I was like, that's an awesome assignment, right? So I was very excited about this, and then actually he came and he dropped the papers off at my desk and says, I want you to grade the grammar, I'll grade the math. What in the world? Why would I do that? First of all, I have a million papers to grade myself. But this idea of isolated professors, the English department will take care of that, or the math department is to address that. I remember, Lee doesn't know this, but I remember when I was sitting at Lee's house one day, she actually was going over, basically this idea of mathematics and how that 2 + 3 = 11, and I'm going, how in any way, in any shape or form is 2 + 3 = 11? And she was talking to me about base, and I was like, oh, that's the coolest thing. Well, when she actually explained to me base, that actually took connection for me within hermeneutics, right? And so the reason I say within hermeneutics, because often books that you're reading have a different hermeneutic. So if you're actually looking at, say, the book of Revelation, and you see that their base often is 12, and we want to strongly hold, by the way, I'm a dispensationalist, so what I'm about to say is going to act like, I hate dispensationalists, but I don't. So this idea of the millennial kingdom, right, is being 1,000 years. But if the 1,000 years is based on this idea of 12, then we're not really 1,000. So this idea of connecting mathematics to something that's very different. And by the way, this idea of the quadrivium is very apparent to this. And the reason I say that is there was a guy in 1000 AD, his name was Hugh of St. Victor. He wrote a book called the Didascalicon. And in this book, he basically argues this point, that if one doesn't know geometry, they can't do hermeneutics well. They can't interpret the Bible well. This is the idea of truly integrated learning. And we have this idea that, we need to move math to the side, or we need to move some other to the side. So dilemma number one is kind of this Walmart approach of that's that department, that's that department. The philosophy of religion, Mrs. Percy did such a great job with this, the idea of upper story and lower story learning, where philosophy and religion department deal with these moral questions. And so what this has done with this isolated professors, I would say this dilemma is not only encouraged by this Walmart approach or this consumer-driven approach, but also through accreditation woes. And so these accreditors, what they often do is when they come in, and they look at your community. And in that community, you're supposed to meet certain standards. And in that certain standards, you're supposed to do this and that and this and that. And what happens actually is it actually changes lots of things within the community. I'd like not to name certain communities or colleges that I'm actually going to accentuate, but at the same time, I'd like to tell some of the stories. One college that I've been affiliated with, they actually changed the entire mission statement of the school. They said that the finding is that when you actually put this idea of Christian general education, it's no longer actually general education because it's called Christian, you see. My point on that is when they change this idea of, they say they never change the mission statement, when in reality, they often do. Another thing they did is we had this class, I remember, that they wanted us to change. It was called Christian Worldview. They said, no, you need to actually address all worldviews, even though this is a strongly Christian school. Another community that I'm aware of is that the creditors came in and they were not going to accredit this university. The consultants went in and they said, well, okay, let's go out to dinner before you give us the answer. But what they had known was the favorite meal of the accreditor. And in this favorite meal of the accreditor, of course, in a duplicitous way, he ordered fried brie. He says, oh, you like fried brie? I like fried brie. Oh, this is wonderful. They struck up this conversation, and as a result, this school is accredited. And you might think that I'm being, just diminutive when I'm in my discussion, but I'm really not. This actually is oftentimes what accreditation does, and sometimes there's an axe to grind. And I've been parts of communities where there was an axe to grind from the accreditors. One actual known case, and I could actually speak of this one and name it. Most of you probably know Master's College from California. And in the Master's College, what actually happened is the accreditors WACS came in the 80s, and basically the Western Association of Colleges and Schools, they came in and basically said, look, we like what you do here, but we want John MacArthur no longer to be your president. What? He was the founder. Well, they actually went to the Supreme Court over this issue. They were not going to accredit, and finally, Master's College, as a result, they won. Another school, and I won't name, but it was down in San Diego, they moved down actually south of where Master's College is. They actually said the same thing to another school. And as a result, this school lost their president, and another president had to come in. My point on that is, often we don't understand I'm going to use a word that I'm going to have to define. We don't understand the myth of the community. The word myth we have actually associated with fairy tales. Myth is not fairy tales. It's authority within the community. And what happens is often we give over the authority in the community wherever we are, and we say, you're the expert, you know what you're talking about, and I don't. Well, that's not the case. If you're in a community that your myth or your authority is, let's just say, the scriptures or a biblical worldview or something like that, and they come in and say, no, you must take off the name Christian in order for you to be accredited. Clearly, that is too difficult for me to bear in my own mind. I would say the second dilemma, again, I'm calling this the Walmart approach, is this isolated students, where a student just endures when they go through the general ed department, right? They just endure, right? What are you doing? I'm just going through GE. Well, I have a personal stake in this, right? Because I'm the department chair of GE. So when they say this, I'm like horrified, So when I'm looking at this, they're just going through GE. Well, does that mean they're just learning skills that they'll never use again? Students think this way. They think that they'll never use those skills again and they never need to bring them back up again. But that's not the case. So this idea of I'm just going to do my GE, no, they're actually gaining skills that are actually very important. Well, what happens is this isolated students are encouraged by accreditors because the accreditation says, look, if you just design a rubric, we'll accredit you. We'll credit you for the college. So you have all these departments that have a multiplicity of rubrics, and they're saying that this means that the child is educated or the person is educated. But that's not the case at all. We realize that actually brings down the educational environment. Another thing that we realize is that you have these specializations all too soon. There are a lot of schools that actually realize that it's not the specialized students that are actually succeeding, but it's those ones that are a little more general that know how to actually associate themselves with other things. Donald Cowan in Unbinding Prometheus makes this point: the task of education is to awaken the imagination. That's what we have to realize. The task of education is to awaken the imagination, not to check boxes on rubrics. To what is known as wisdom, for the sake of wisdom alone, and not for a political or economic gain. Let me say that again, without all of my ad-libbing. The task of education is to awaken the imagination to what is known as wisdom, for the sake of wisdom alone, and not for political or economic gain. Students will not move forward until they realize that. Most students don't think this way. They seek the end without concerning the journey and its results. College, Dostoevsky, I think, in Notes from the Underground, makes this point absolutely clear. What he realizes is he's actually, some of you may have read the book, and in the book, basically he makes this point that he has a great job, he has a great career, he's in this great thing, and he makes this point halfway through the book. He says that I'm ungrateful, I'm a sick man, I have a toothache, he says. But he says that he makes the point is because that he's phenomenologically ungrateful. I mean, he doesn't know how to touch the world. He doesn't know how to live in the present. Because his whole job has been to live in the future and never to live now as the helping and loving and doing the very things that God has called us to do. I'd say delusion number three, or dilemma number three, rather. I get my D's mixed up. Dilemma number three. You have isolated administration. Isolated administration. I know that at a school where I was, there was, before I actually became on staff there, they had one person who did accreditation. And by the way, this is what most schools do. They have a few people actually who deal with accreditation. And this is what happens oftentimes. Every college has a mission and vision statement, every one. But most professors fail to translate that to any part of the student's experience. They don't, because remember, there's a department for that. Right? It doesn't mean anything that the student should know this. The mission and vision becomes smoke and mirrors. Smoke and mirrors for whom? The accreditors, of course. That only the school's accrediting experts know, and thus it is not translated in the classroom. So I would think that every time you see a mission statement, you should say, does the students actually do these things? And oftentimes you're going to find the answer to be no. As a result, no authority is established and no parameters are set for the institution. Thus, personal pursuits are the only bar set for the professors and the professionals. We have to realize that there is a mythos or a myth within every community, and you need to find that authority within the community and realize that is that the place or the environment that I want to put my child? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes the answer is no. And I would say let's move on to the discovery. What should we discover in all of this? So what are colleges talking about? And the reason I'm making this point is I know that some of you, I kind of went on a high level, and some of you guys, this doesn't help me at all with the idea of getting my kid into college. Well, okay, let me tell you what they're talking about. I'll tell you what everyone is talking about as it relates to college. And so you could actually check the boxes if you feel that that is the best thing for you to do, which, as you could hear me in my sarcasm, that is not the best thing to do. So the first buzzword within kind of college accreditation is cross-curricular. They want to see how things are actually moving, writing across the curriculum. Does the math department do this, or does the English department do this? Do they actually do this together? Is there kind of this cross-pollination of things? And I would argue that every homeschool community already does this if you're not focusing on credits. I know for me, we're learning geography, right? Of course, anybody who's in classical conversations, geography is like, you got the Lord and geography, right? So geography is very important, right? So I'm going through different states. We travel quite a bit with family. And so if that's not cross-curricular, I don't know what is. If my son, for example, he's learning math. He's what, third grade? He's learning math right now. So, just the typical rudimentary math. My son learned more math the other day than any before. This is what happened. So I told my son when he turns 9 that he could actually mow the neighbor's lawn for money, but when he's 8, he has to mow it free. So of course last summer, of course he mowed lawns free. But this summer, of course, he went to the neighbor and he said, I'd like to mow your lawn. And he asked, Dad, how much do I charge him? I said, well, it's a big lawn, so $15. Of course, he thought that he was on top of the world. Well, he thought that that meant both the front yard and backyard, my son thought. Well, he learned multiplication very quickly when the actual customer went and gave him $30. You see, that's cross-curricular. That's this idea of moving two things at once. And oftentimes we want to diminish those things on a resume. Don't diminish those things. People want to see these things, you see. The next buzzword is assessment mapping. Do you have a systematic approach to your homeschool education? And the answer is that's where I think that some of us homeschool families could actually learn a few things. And I would say those people that are in classical conversations, yes, there's a systematic curriculum. You could see from foundations through to essentials, through to challenge programs, and so on. If this is the systematic approach you take, I promise you the colleges are very happy about that. I know one college person, actually, one professor at a college who's a theology professor, a real brilliant guy. He said this, I said, what would you say to me as a professor at another college, or I'm sorry, as a high school teacher? I was a high school teacher at the time. So what would you say to me is the most important thing to teach the kids before they come to the thing? He said, stories. These students don't know stories. They think they have everything, but they have nothing. And so it's this idea of we have this, we think that it's important to tell stories, but we think that actually checking boxes are more important. Tell the story of your family. Tell the story of Christ. Tell the story of the Old and New Testament. These are important issues. And so having a systematic approach to doing that is a great idea. So we have to ask, of course, assessment mapping is how is the GE classes being addressed in every field of study? How are the general education things being addressed in every field of study? That's kind of the buzzword within the colleges. And the third one is embedded assessments. These are the third buzzword. If you do not use the term embedded assessment to accreditors, they'll think that you are just a joke. And the reason I say that is they have to make sure that in every class that you're doing general education. Don't think that if your child is quote-unquote engineering-minded or math-minded or something like that, that means that they don't have to actually do some general education. No, they have to do a lot. Because these are the things that the colleges are talking about. This idea of cross-curricular, this idea of assessment mapping, systematizing actually what you're doing and why you're doing it, and an embedded assessment. So it's this idea of going back to what am I doing and why am I doing it? We must go back to that consistently to have this next idea, if you will. Discovery number 2. Don't allow the college's goals to be your ends. And oftentimes we do this. We forfeit this idea. We forfeit what we're supposed to be doing, training up our children in the way they should go. We forfeit this idea that we should be speaking to them with all kinds of things so that they actually would love God. If that is our goal, then let that be our goal. Don't let their goal be your end. So be aware that, being aware is good, but being preoccupied with this whole idea of credits in college and that thing is bad. Remember, or don't forget this, and I don't even want to use this word, but I'm going to need to just to prove the point. Students or children are the consumers at a college. Colleges do not want to just kick them out. They don't want to just bypass them. They want them. And so don't think that they're trying just to be adversarial toward you. And I would say the third discovery. The third discovery, what are the right questions then? What are the right questions? The right questions that you should ask are not, what does that college want? The question that should be is, in what can my child succeed? In what can my child succeed? Because when you find that, encourage it. Encourage it. I know for me, my 11-year-old daughter, like I said, she's obviously quite motivated. If she got Memory Master this year, she's quite diligent with her work. She's very strong. But her biggest things, she loves cooking. So should I actually pigeonhole her and say, look, I need you to be an engineer? Right? It's just silly. That's silly. Is it her goals or is it my goals? Or restate, is it God's goal for my child in the sense of, remember, God is the one that's going to move away the obstacles to put them in the place where God has designed them. It's not me who's doing that, and oftentimes I seek to manipulate that, and that's not a good idea. Next question I would say, in what context is my child best understood? In what context is my child best understood? Accentuate that. Put them in those contexts. And then I would further say, put that on the resume. Don't think that that's actually a bad idea. Put that on the resume. My son, for example, I seem to brag on my kids, well, because I love them, but on one hand, but my son, for example, he loves to wrestle. Dad did too. He loved to wrestle, but Dad, unlike son, I actually lost every single match for 2 years. Well, that's totally not true. I won one. So I always want to keep that in front of everybody. But my son, on the other hand, he's a 6-time All-American. He's 9. My point on that is very simple. If that's what context he succeeds most in, I'm going to accentuate that in a lot of different places. It's not the dabbling in things that a lot of times colleges look to. It's not my kid, was a basketball player and a football player and a hockey player and a badminton person and so on and so forth. It's not all those things. It's what context do they actually love the most. Accentuate that thing. Next question. Why am I sending my child to this school? Don't say, oh, I hope they accept them. No. Ask the question, why am I actually choosing that school above something else? Is it because of the things that we're delusional about? And if it's those things that we're delusional about, well, then we're delusional. Who do I desire them to learn under? That's a huge question. Do I want them to learn under people that I actually respect? Restate, it should be that they respect. You see, what I want to do for my children, I know they're young, but what I want to do with my children is I want to create friends for them. And I want those friends to be the people that they want to learn under later. So that they're actually looking at college in a totally different way, as a mentorship relationship, not as something just to endure. And I would say the last question, and there's a myriad of questions that you could ask, but of course I need to narrow this. What does my child most desire? Broaden their horizons. Let that connect to 1,000 other things. Do not let colleges stifle your mission and vision for your child. You answer for them, meaning you answer for your children. The colleges don't answer for them. So what should I do about this? Well, I would say this is what I'm doing presently. This is what I actually am doing. My wife has encouraged me in this way, and I work on these accrediting things often, and I probably should be a little bit more forthright than my wife on this, because she's saying, honey, we need to write a mission and vision for our family. And as a result, I'm going, really? I write missions and visions all day? But I should. This is what I should be doing. And so this morning I got up and encouraged by my wife, encouraged by this talk, and this is what I'm thinking. I'm thinking when I design my transcripts, obviously I'm not doing that now, but when I design the transcripts, I want to show that my schooling has been focused and systematic. And so I'm going to show this by this idea of a mission statement. And I would like to do it this way. The goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart. Now, obviously you see that that's the 1 Timothy 1 passage, right? The goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart. So how am I going to do this? I'm going to glorify God through discovery. I'm going to stimulate a lifestyle of learning and excellence. I'm going to concentrate, and I'm not going to dabble. I'm going to establish an integrated discoverer who understands the context and consequences of their education socially and civically. And then I'm going to show how my classes, my homeschooling, actually does those things. Because that's what they want to see. Think through all of your activities. Don't just dabble in everything thinking that the college want to see some lengthy transcript and say that he or she has done everything. Instead, show them where they have succeeded in an art, in an athletic event, or in an athletics, or in occupation endeavors. If my son takes this idea of mowing lawns to a whole new level, you better believe I'm going to put that on the transcript. We need to prepare, I would say that this other idea, this is kind of as a side note, and because there is some sense of me that wants to a little bit like the colleges and some things they do, but I would say that one thing that I would do is, of course, prepare for standardized tests a little bit, but don't let that be your preoccupation. Remember this. When I was on the pilot of the SAT, it's the last thing I'm going to leave you with. When I was on the pilot of the SAT, I was in the pilot, and I also graded for 2 years the writing portion. You're given, as a grader, 45 seconds to a minute and a half to grade that writing assignment. Let me say that again. The very thing that your kid was so stressed about, the grader is given in about a minute. So remember, but I would also say, okay, so what should I do about it? There are techniques, because remember, if you're grading for about 2 minutes, roughly a minute to 2 minutes, there is a technique, and learning that technique is a good idea. I would say prepare for standardized tests, but do not let it be your preoccupation. What should be your preoccupation is that you are to train up your children. Your preoccupation should not be this idea that, oh, the colleges won't like us. I would say that is not what we're answering for. We're answering for the very ones that God has put under our tutelage, and we are to manage them. We are to manage them in a way that we can please God when we present them to Him. Thank you.
Let's talk about the nitty-gritty of making a transcript. I mean, are you serious that what you just said is literally what you would hand in to?
The first thing I would do is, without a question, I would write a mission and vision, without question. And I would show how that I'm actually implementing that systematically. Of course, what would I make sure that I put in there? Of course, I think that it's very important for my child to do physics. I think that that's very important, Why then? I think it's important not because of credits. I think it's important because this is how it actually fulfills my mission and vision. So that's what I would do. Of course, I would do those things that maybe they would expect. But remember, not all colleges actually want the same thing. There's some colleges that are real specialized, and so some of them want, say, 4 sciences. Some of them want 2 sciences or what have you. But I would say that, yeah, you can look at what they are looking for, but don't let that be your preoccupation.
So if you have a goal for a specific school, at what point?
I would say right there, I'm off. The goal cannot be the specific school. If that is the goal, then I think we're missing it. And the reason I think that we're missing it is simply because our goal should be something much bigger than that, right? So, but if that's the bar at which I'm reaching, then yeah, go ahead and do that.
It's just a low bar.
Yes, it's quite low. Because remember, I think that what you say is wonderful, and it really helped me out, even looking at my kids. My kids are royalty, and if I'm looking at them in that way, I'm not going, man, they will be royalty when they get into. No, they're royalty already, and so my job is to manage them.
Okay, so I don't know if it was really clear from either my introduction or what you said, but tell us at an occupational level, like the specifics of what you do, so if someone has a question about the accreditation process and who knocks at the door and how much it costs, or whatever your questions are, just
I don't ever know how much it costs because I'm not on that level, but okay, so what I do is I actually taught high school for about 10 years or so, while at the same time I was also teaching college. And I was asked to come over and help with the general ed department at a College of Biblical Studies. And what my job is to do is to, quote unquote, make the general ed department accreditation proof. And so what do I have to do? Well, I have to think through all the departments and write rubrics. That's really what I'm doing. And so why am I doing this? Because that's what they want. They want to see that you're actually doing something, but in reality, that's not what they're doing. What's going on is they come in, they give you the recommendations, and basically it's kind of like, I'm sure that many of you probably sold a house in here, and you remember when the person who comes over does an inspection on your house, and he says, look, these are the best practices out there. Well, oftentimes those are the dumbest things you've ever heard of in your life. And they're really not the best practices, this is kind of some arbitrary rule. Recently I sold a house and they asked me to put this pan under my water heater. I said, why? Now, it's the same type of thing. They're coming in to verify that you're doing something that to some degree arbitrary.
Have you ever heard of things that college, the accreditation institutes are saying that would preclude homeschoolers or emphasize homeschoolers, or do they even consider
Yeah, I
us?
would say emphasize. I mean, there's not a college that I'm aware of that go, oh, them homeschoolers. Not even one that I'm aware of. If they are, certainly that's silly. There's a lot of schools actually that are actually carving out space, if you will, for their scholarships and things like that, because they know that we have raised the bar to the degree of which most schools haven't even come close. So my point on that is there is a myth out there that says, and remember I'm using this idea of myth as authority, there's this authority out there that is really not real, that is delusional, that says that colleges don't want homeschoolers. That's silly. So.
Okay. All right, so questions from the audience? Yeah. Oh yeah, let that run.
Isn't it well known that certain colleges produce certain kind of products, if you will? You know, if I want a Ford, I go to the Ford dealership. If I want a Honda, I go to the Honda dealership. You know, if I want an engineer, I'm going to go to the engineering school. If I want a doctor, I'm going to go to the school that produces the best doctors. I mean, that's part of the reality that we live in, and the perspective of those who we live with in the business world is that when they're looking for a product, they're looking for certain schools.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Sure.
You live in that business world, I assume. Yes. Okay. You could say that let's use a kind of a general, let's say Vanderbilt, great reputation, right? How long does the reputation of Vanderbilt last within the occupation?
Well, normally it's the first or second position, and that's it.
No, I guess what I'm saying is usually about a month, right?
Yeah. Okay.
And I guess what I'm saying to that is simple. This idea of first impressions, right, is one thing, but lasting impressions is an entirely different thing, right? So I would say that, certain schools actually produce a certain product. For example, petroleum engineer, I mean, A&M, that's what they're known for. Why? I mean, you're thinking Houston area. So certainly that's how they think, but at the same time, I would say that let us not be preoccupied by first impressions, because, again, that's a first impression idea. So to encourage this idea that only Baylor produces this type of student, I think is a little bit too strong. I'll just say it that way.
Okay.
That doesn't help you in a practical way, though, does it?
Okay.
Right. And see, that's the problem that we face right now. I mean, look, these two gentlemen are very sincere. They're homeschoolers, and what did they just call our children?
Products to be measured.
We can't get away from our industrial paradigm. It's very hard, and it's very practical. They need to pay the bills. So I'm not saying it's a wrong question or a bad question. I'm saying maybe it's an incomplete question, or there's more, or there's new questions. You know, I'm not sure exactly what it is. And so we began this conversation last year in our practicums. Because you do want your company to be profitable. I want my company to be profitable, right? We do want that. And there's 6 billion people out there, and we have to have some way to assess, because we can't go interview all 6 billion of them. So we are using certain ways to measure. And measurement's not a bad thing. God made inches and standards and things like that. So we're not saying anything, at least I don't think I'm saying anything negative about it, but I'm saying it's so small compared to what a person really is. There's so much more. And we might want to work on, the kind of questions you're talking about, with our older students. But what's happening in education is, you've got first, second, and third graders with multiple teachers who are specialized now. It's gotten out of hand, and I guess in my opinion, so you're shaking your head. So can you buy that part of the conversation so that maybe as we continue this conversation, we can maybe start to develop a different idea in the next 20 years, or see what to do differently. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. Because it is frustrating for us who went to college. I have an engineering degree, you have an engineering degree, and we know what it looked like. But is it possible it used to look like something else? So, and that's why we read the classical books, Carry On Mr. Bowditch, or Gallens the Doctor, Galens. There's other people who've done it differently than we've done it the last 100 years, and we have discarded that, and we're trying to bring it back into the conversation.
One thing I do know, the one I'd like to address just for a moment, this idea of occupation. I just like to speak to it just so that I don't like to be too ethereal, okay? Okay, so what are colleges actually doing? They're actually bulking up their general ed departments. The old standard used to be 30 hours. Probably we all probably went under this idea of 30 hours. Now they have 45 hours as the normative situation. You'd say for whom? Engineers. And so what is that actually saying? They're saying that we forgot something along the way, right? And we forgot something very, very important. And so why are they saying that? They're saying the people that used to go to, you just use the term Vanderbilt, that used to go to Vanderbilt, they're no longer Vanderbilt types, if you will. So to argue that my son or daughter should go to a certain school because 50 years ago it was awesome. I know one thing, that if my son wanted to be a preacher, I wouldn't send him to Yale, right? But if we think through that just for a moment, would I want my kid to be a Spurgeonite? Yeah, absolutely. So that's why I think it's an interesting question that I really can't answer appropriately or very respectfully restate it that way. So.
And also the way colleges educate is rapidly changing. I mean, maybe you can speak to, if you know, the online schools and the lack of relationship and discipline, and who can teach these days?
Yeah, so the one part of my slide that I know that was different probably for some was this idea of learning versus education. I think that learning certainly takes place online. I think it can. I think learning can take place almost anywhere, right? I think you can learn on a cruise, if you want. But I think in community is where education actually takes place. And so this idea of online education is, to me, an oxymoron, right? I could say online learning, certainly that's okay, meaning that there might be a skill to be attained, but community is where education really takes place. And I think that online learning is actually short-circuiting what we really want to do in educating our next generation.
Okay, other questions? Yeah. You. Okay.
I got one.
Oh, she's going. I'm sorry, I missed that.
My question had to do with if you've seen any trend towards training people in an apprenticeship versus going to college. A lot of the books that we read in CC, that was how people used to
there's not a school.
study the Amish people. They typically teach their children through 8th grade, and yet they're running multi-million, corporations, and they've only gone through 8th grade, but that's because they do have a learning community where people help each other. And I just think that a college degree simply tells someone that you're trainable. To me, that's all. When I got my college degree, my parents told me that that's just going to certify to someone that you can be trained.
Yeah, I guess I didn't hear
Yeah.
the question. I guess I heard the first part of the question, and because my memory is what it is, I wanted to answer it right away because now I forgot. But I think that you were asking, am I seeing a trend of apprenticeships? And I would say that this idea of trend toward apprenticeships in colleges, they're trying to be so consumer-driven that it's not working real well. And even accrediting agencies are putting people like that under fire. There's a lot of schools that are not being accredited. I don't want to name any that are apprenticeship types, and they're no longer being accredited. Now, I think that that's sometimes good, sometimes bad. But
And they're not being accredited because they don't fit the rubric? They're trying to do something different?
yeah, they're trying to say, yeah, we're doing general ed. No, they're not. They're doing apprenticeship, right? So yeah, I've seen a trend where they're moving that way because it's so consumer-driven. While at the same time, I think the accrediting agencies are realizing that's not necessarily a good school to accredit for basic skills of what a college education should be.
So And part of the things that, we can do, because as homeschoolers, we tend to think a little differently than the rest of the world. There's a homeschooling dad near Cary, Research Triangle in North Carolina, and he takes 6 students a year to come live with him. And he's top-line programmer. He's a craftsman in software development. And the kids live with them for a year, and then they go become employed. They don't need to go to college. They live with the best, and then everybody wants them. So there's other ways to think about this. And it might be that college, and let's think about the word college. It comes from the idea of colleagues. The point of going to college was to hang out with colleagues, people who cared about the same things. And so we've changed that, right? Why? Because when you learn to think, you want to think with people who like to think about the things you like to think about, and it sharpens you, right? That's going to happen in a place with a lot of time spent on the things that your colleagues love. But that's not what universities have become anymore. They're a list of 6 or 7 things each year you check off with a different person, different students, different books, no continuity. And yet at the end, you're educated by some standard. So we're questioning this, and think how natural this is. 30 years ago, people thought if you homeschooled your first grader, you were crazy. Right? 20, 15 years ago, you're homeschooling your high schooler, you're crazy. Well, now we're saying, what about college? And I'm not saying that we're homeschooling college. I'm saying the sky's the limit. There's a big world out there. Let's talk about other ways to do things so that we're just not pigeonholed. Okay, other questions?
I think she had one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was actually,
I actually wanted to talk about when you were talking about the online and the community, because I think as homeschoolers, as we're training up our children, we are providing a community, even if we aren't, everybody in the home isn't necessarily learning the same subject. And I think that can go over into college. You were saying that with online, you don't have the same kind of community as you do at a college, and I think that we do provide a community, and this isn't really a question, it's more of a kind of an argument. I think that you can bring it back on me if you want.
Yeah, I'll bring it back just a little bit, because I teach online. Okay. I don't even like even saying that. What a hypocrite up there. Okay, pays the bills. Okay, so...
Hear that? It's a product.
Sorry, I have children. Okay, so even as a professor who thinks the way I do, I know that I am not giving my students the product that I really want to give them, right? So what community are they trying to learn in? Well, they should be coming to my class because of, well, it's what I'm an expert in, right? And that's the community that she should, or he should, be a part of. It's this idea of being collegial, right? And so if we want to take a curriculum and drop it in the house and call that community, that's okay. I'm not arguing against that. But just remember that even Don Hicks in Norms of Nobility makes the point that the professor or the teacher or the administrator of the curriculum is the curriculum more than anything else. So as a result, I'm thinking, well, I'm actually administering the curriculum in some ways, right? But then the parent is administering the curriculum, but then I'm giving the grade. That just seems very weird to me, right? To say that it's community.
And I see what you're saying, but I think that, like, for me, and you're right, the curriculum, the writer of the curriculum is really the one that ends up being instructor on the online community. And so when we know what curriculum is being used and what is going on, it's almost like they become that more of an independent learner, that it becomes a self, they're self-driven through this curriculum in a guided way by the instructor.
I would absolutely agree with you that
it
encourages discipline, without question.
Okay.
It encourages discipline, no doubt about it.
I like online.
Okay, because of time, we have got to move on. But before you kind of finish your thing, AJ, can you come up and talk about Rivendell? We wanted to get a description of what Mrs. Piercy's going to be. Are you actually teaching there now, or you're starting in the fall? Okay, and he wanted to share with us, because they have a different vision for collegiate education than a lot of universities do. We also, again, have the Patrick Henry gentleman back here, and then HSLDA and Generation Joshua. Make sure you talk to them, too. Okay. Let's thank Charles. And then, while AJ's speaking, where are my students? Right here? Or you okay, Sarah? Good. All right, the students will be on next, so go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been able to connect with some of you guys, but I work with Rivendell Sanctuary. Nancy and her husband are joining us full-time now, and what we're doing is we're providing apprenticeship-based teaching to students for the first 2 years of college. I just had a great conversation with a student who recently graduated. I'm just here today saying, I got to get these first 2 years done, and that just that idea of what we're doing with education, the purpose of education becomes to complete it, and that is very backwards from what we see Christ did with his disciples, the way that when he lived with them, and his students never changed classes, classmates, or professors. What it did was it gave Christ the opportunity to observe, the ability to build a relationship, and the time that he needed to really pour into them and mentor them. So we have, what we have is an 18-month program. It's at the first 2 years of college, completed in 18 months, because we don't take the summers off. And we do that because we don't feel like that's conducive to learning. And so when a student joins, if you come to Rivendell this coming fall, we're starting 2 classes of 30. And if you become a student in one of these groups of 30, you'll be in a classroom with 29 other students and 4 faculty, and you will be mentored by those faculty for 18 months, and you'll live with that same community. And you'll never change classes, classmates, or professors. We live within community. We work together as a community. We go to Italy to study the fine arts together for 6 weeks as a community. We study the Sistine Chapel in the Sistine Chapel. So we study the fine arts in Florence, Venice, and Rome, and a beautiful villa in Italy. But we eat together. These are the things we do that our students do as groups, as essentially cohorts that never change classes, classmates, or professors. And the ultimate goal of this is, any given school, any given college is going to, I really appreciated what Chuck was saying about not seeking out a college for that college's reputation, addressing the gentleman's question here in the back, and some of the ambiguity that kind of finished with that. But really what I heard was this idea of if you're pursuing something, you need to realize that really only 15% of a person's ability to get a job, move ahead in a job, is the skill itself, or any of the credentials that got them in the door. 85% of it is the life skills, the ability that you have to relate with the person next to you. If you're a jerk to everybody around you, no one wants to work with you, you're not staying at that company very long. So that's why we want to teach you so much more than just the academics. We want to teach you the life skills. We want to teach you the things that you need to succeed, not only in college, but in citizenship. And so a lot of schools, their goal is they're going to reward you based on your academic performance. If you had a 4.0 in high school, we'll give you a scholarship. If you graduate with straight A's from college, we'll call you summa cum laude. But really what that does is that shows any one of us that we're good at taking tests, but it doesn't really reflect your character. So we want to move beyond creating honor students and create students of honor. Because students of honor become CEOs of honor, politicians of honor, mechanics of honor, mothers and fathers of honor. The list goes on and on. So that's who we are in a brief nutshell. I'm around today. Nancy and I are both part of this thing, and it's a very exciting thing. So a tremendous thank you for having me here. And I will be around all day and would love to talk to anyone. Our next class starts in the middle of August. So, and we still have availability for that.
Where are you located?
We are, I always forget to mention this, and maybe it's subconscious because we're located in Minnesota. So maybe, so we have, we have a full 55-acre campus up in the Twin Cities.
Thanks, AJ. We need